Greetings. My name is Cassandra-Floyd, also known as Iyapo Ngina, and today is day one of the beginning of the reading of The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Zhu and Barbara Moore. This book was published initially in 1983, and this will be the fourth time that I'm reading this book. Now, I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro before going in, and then from now on, all I'll be doing is announcing who I am and then getting right into the reading. So, just a quick overview. The reason that I felt it was important to read this book live, which I've already done once about a year ago, was because of the period that we're in and the eerie significance of a book that was written in 1980, I want to say 1987, 1989. So anyway, this book is important. And since I read the book live on Facebook a year ago, I've gotten a lot of requests, some demands to reread the book and to also facilitate a book club / educational series on the book. So for those who are tuning in, who will be continuing to tune in, I will be reading this book daily until I am finished with the book. There are 52 chapters in the book. I encourage people to hit me up. The details are in the description below because I will be facilitating a Zoom sum up or educational series of the book twice a month on every first and third Sunday of the month until July 17th. And also, the book is available online as a PDF. So if you're interested in receiving that, I can also send that to you. I encourage people to buy the book or have it printed out because it is one that you're going to, want to pull out your highlighters and your bookmarkers and your ink pens because it's deep. I read the book 4 times, and that is because each time that I've read it, I've retrieved something from it that I missed before or was subtle before and now comes forward. So with that being said, again, I will be your reader for quite a few weeks. I am Iyapo. Some know me as Cassandra, others know me as the Rogue Black Girl. And today we're going to be beginning with the section that is entitled Women's Early Culture, the Beginnings, Chapter 1, which is the first sex. In the beginning, we were all created female. In the beginning was a very female sea. For 2.5 billion years on Earth, all life forms floated in the womb-like environment of the planetary ocean, nourished and protected by its fluid chemicals, rocked by the lunar tidal rhythms. Charles Darwin believed the menstrual cycle originated here, organically echoing the moon pulse of the sea. And because this longest period of life's time on Earth was dominated by marine forms reproducing parthenogenetically, he concluded that the female principle was primordial. In the beginning, life did not gestate within the body of any creature, but within the ocean womb containing all organic life. There were no specialized sexed organs. Rather, a generalized female existence reproduced itself within the female body of the sea. Before more complex life forms could develop and move onto land, it was necessary to miniaturize the oceanic environment to reproduce it on a small and mobile scale. Soft, moist eggs deposited on dry land and exposed to air would die. Life could not move beyond the water-hugging amphibian stage. In the course of evolution, the ocean, the protective and nourishing space, the amniotic fluids, even the lunar tidal rhythm, was transformed into the individual female body. And the penis, a mechanical device for land reproduction, evolved. The penis first appeared in the age of the reptiles about 200 million years ago. Our archetypal association of the snake with the phallus contains, no doubt, this genetic memory. This is a fundamental and recurring pattern in nature. Life is a female environment in which the male appears, often periodically, and created by the female to perform highly specialized tasks related to species reproduction and a more complex evolution. Daphnia, a freshwater crustacean, reproduces several generations of females by parthenogenesis. The egg, the egg and its own polar body mate to form a complete set of genes for a female offspring. Once annually, at the end of the year's cycle, a short-lived male offspring, a short-lived male group is produced. The males specialize in functioning leathery egg cases able to survive the winter. Among honeybees, the drone group is produced and regulated by the sterile daughter workers and the fertile queen. Drones exist to mate with the queen. An average of 7 drones per hive accomplish this act each season, and then the entire male group is destroyed by the workers. Among whiptail lizards in the American Southwest, 4 species are parthenogenetic. Males are unknown among the desert grassland plateau and Chihuahua whiptails and have been found only rarely among the checkered whiptails. Among mammals, even among humans, parthenogenesis is not technically impossible. Every female egg contains a polar body with a complete set of chromosomes. The polar body and the egg, if united, could form a daughter embryo. In fact, ovarian cysts are unfertilized eggs that have joined with their polar bodies, been implanted in the ovarian wall, and started to develop there. This is not to say that males are an unnecessary sex. Parthenogenesis is a cloning process. Sexual reproduction, which enhances the variety and health of the gene pool, is necessary for the kind of complex evolution that has produced the human species. The point being made here is simply that when it comes to the two sexes, one of us has been around a lot longer than the other. In The Nature and Evolution of Female Sexuality, Mary Jane Sheffrey, MD, described her discovery in 1961 of something called the inductor theory. The inductor theory stated that, quote, all mammalian embryos, male and female, are anatomically female during the early stages of fetal life, end quote. Sheffrey wondered why this theory had been buried in all the medical literature since 1951, completely ignored by the profession. The men who made this history-making discovery simply didn't want it to be true. Sheffrey pioneered the discussion of the inductor theory, and now, with modifications based on further data, its findings are accepted as facts of mammalian, including human, development. As Stephen Jay Gould describes it, the embryo in its first 8 weeks is an indifferent creature with bisexual potential. In the 8th week, if a Y chromosome-bearing sperm fuses with the egg, the gonads will develop into testes, which secrete androgen, which in turn induces male genitalia to develop. In the absence of androgen, the embryo develops into a female. There is a difference in the development of the internal and external genitalia, however. For the internal genitalia, the fallopian tubes and ovaries, or the sperm-carrying ducts, the early embryo contains precursors of both sexes. In the presence or absence of androgen, as one set develops, the other degenerates. With the external genitalia, the different organs of male and females develop along diverging lines from the same precursor. This means, in effect, that the clitoris and the penis are the same organ, formed from the same tissue. The labia majora and the scrotum are one, indistinguishable in the early embryonic stages. In the presence of androgen, the two lips simply grow longer, fold over, and fuse along the midline, forming the scrotal sac. Good concludes, quote, the female course of development is, in a sense, biologically intrinsic to all mammals. It is the pattern that unfolds in the absence of any hormonal influence. The male root is a modification induced by secretion of androgens from the developing testes. The vulnerability of the male newcomer within the female environment is well known. Vaginal secretions are more destructive to the Y-bearing sperm. The mortality rate is higher among neonate and infant males. Within the womb, the male fetus for the first 2 months is protected by being virtually indistinguishable from female. After that, it must produce large amounts of the masculinizing hormone in order to, quote, defend itself as male, to achieve and to maintain its sexual identity. For all we know, the Near Eastern myths upon which our Western mythologies are built, those which portray the young god or hero battling against a female dragon, have some analog here in utero, where the male fetus wages a kind of chemical war against re-becoming female. For now, it is enough to say that maleness among mammals is not a primary state, but differentiates from the original female biochemistry and anatomy. The original libido of warm-blooded animals is female, and the male or maleness is a derivation from this primary female pattern. Why then do the medical men, the scientists, take longer to figure out this basic biological fact that it took them to split the atom? Why? And why? Once this fact was noted, did they turn around and bury it in professional silence for 10 years until a woman dug it up again? Why indeed? For about 2,000 years of Western history, female sexuality was denied. When it could not be denied, it was condemned as evil. The female was seen as divinely designed to be a passive vessel, serving reproductive purposes only. In one not too ancient dictionary, quote, clitoris was defined as a rudimentary organ, while masculinity equaled the cosmic generative force, equaled the cosmic generative force. With Freud, female sexuality was not so much rediscovered as pathologized. Freud dismissed the clitoris as an undeveloped masculine organ and defined original libido as male. Clitoral eroticism was reduced to a perverse neurosis. Even after Masters and Johnson's laboratory studies were published in Human Sexual Response in 1966, their findings were not integrated into psychoanalytical theory. In Mary Jane Sheffrey's research during that period, she found not one work of comparative anatomy that described or even mentioned the deeper lying clitoral structures, yet every other structure of the human body was described in living detail. Even today, with our relative sophistication of 1987, we are frequently whistled at by magazine headlines that promise breathless articles announcing the discovery of the new spot, a G spot, an X spot located within the vagina. Within all these new spots exists the old, wistful desire to deny the existence of the clitoris as a trigger organ of female orgasm. Why? There is the generalized traditional fear of female sexuality. Further, there is this discomfort with the similarity with the common origin of the female clitoris and the male penis. Women are used to hearing the clitoris described as an undeveloped penis. Men are not used to thinking of the penis as an overdeveloped clitoris. Finally, and most seriously, there is a profound psychological and institutional reluctance to face the repercussions of the fact that the female clitoris is the only organ in the human body whose purpose is exclusively that of erotic stimulation and release. What does this mean? It means that for the human female alone among all of Earth's life forms, sexuality and reproduction are not inseparable. It is the male penis, carrier of both semen and sexual response, that is simultaneously procreative and erotic. If we wanted to reduce one of the sexes to a purely reproductive function on the basis of its anatomy, and we don't, it would be the male sex that qualified for such a reduction, not the female, not the human female. But these are only biological facts. These are only biological realities. As we know, facts and realities can be and are systematically ignored in the service of established ideologies. Throughout the world today, virtually all religious, cultural, economic, and political institutions stand where they were built centuries ago on the solid foundation of an erroneous concept, a concept that assumes the psychic passivity, the creative inferiority, and the sexual secondariness of women. This enshrined concept states that men exist to create the human world, while women exist to reproduce humans. Period. If we argue that data exists not solely biological, but archaeological, mythological, anthropological, and historical data, which refutes the universality of this erroneous concept, we are told to shut up because something called God supports the erroneous concept, and that's all that matters. That is the final word. Throughout the world, throughout what we know of history, something called God has been used to support the denial, the condemnation, and the mutilation of female sexuality, of the female sex ourselves. Today, in parts of Africa, predominantly among African Muslims, but also among African Christians and Jews and some tribal beliefs, young girls are still subjected to clitoridectomies. This surgery, often performed by older women with broken glass or knives, excises the clitoris, severing the nerves of the orgasm. The operation is intended to force the girl to concentrate on her vagina as a reproductive vessel solely. Infibulation, a more thorough operation, removes the labia minora and much of the labia majora. The girl is then closed up with thorns or required to lie with her legs tied together until the entire vaginal orifice is fused shut, with a straw inserted to allow the passage of urine and menstrual blood. On the wedding night, the young girl is slit open by a midwife or her husband. Further cutting and reclosing is performed before and after childbirth. Complications from these surgeries are numerous, including death from infection, hemorrhage, inability to urinate, scar tissue preventing dilation during labor, painful coitus, and infertility due to chronic pelvic infection. In 1976, an estimated 10 million women were involved with this operation, and something called God justified it. A God who supposedly created young girls as filthy sex maniacs who must then be mutilated to turn them into docile breeders. The word infibulation comes from the Latin fibula, which meaning clasp. Those civilized Romans, great highway builders, also invented the technology of fastening metal clasps through the prepuces of young girls to enforce chastity. This practice was copied by Christian crusaders during the early Middle Ages in Europe. They locked up their wives and daughters in metal chastity belts and then took the keys with them while they were gone, often for many years, fighting for God in the Near East. And lest, though hypocrisy and racism, we dismiss these practices as merely barbaric or ancient, we must recall that clitoridectomies were performed in the last century on young girls and women in both Europe and America. This surgery, very popular with 19th century Victorians, was inflicted on any female considered to be oversexed or as punishment for masturbation or as a cure for madness. These determinations were all made by male relatives, male physicians, and male clerics, and the women involved had no legal say in the matter. These are extreme examples of the repression and mutilation of female sexuality, always sanctioned, however, remotely or dishonestly by something called God. All the other repressions and mutilations of the body, of the mind, of the soul, of our experienced female selves are so well known and documented that they need no numeration at this point. We can all make our own list. The point is, wherever repression of female sexuality and of the female sex exists, and at the present writing, this is everywhere on earth, we find the same underlying assumptions. These are ontological assumptions, assumptions made at the very root of things about the nature of life itself. They are 1, that the world was created by a male deity figure or God, and 2, that existing world orders or cultures were made by and for men with God's sanction. 3, that females are an auxiliary sex who exist to serve and populate these male world orders. 4, that autonomous female sexuality poses a wild and lethal threat to these world orders and therefore must be controlled and repressed. And finally, 5, that God's existence as a male sanctions this repression. The perfect circularity or tautology of these assumptions only helps to bind them more securely around the human psyche. That they are as erroneous as they are universal seems to pose no problem to their upholders. After all, wherever we go on earth, every intact institution, religious, legal, governmental, economic, military, communications, and customs, is built on a solid slab of these assumptions. And that's a pretty entrenched error. In post World War II United States, as well as in Europe, and most of the world generally, we've gone through a secularizing period in which some of these assumptions have been loosened up and even been made to crumble under questioning. But now the backlash is upon us. Today, spokespeople for various fundamentalist organizations, fundamentalist religious beliefs, use modern media to broadcast a very old idea that female sexuality, i.e., feminists and feminist demands for abortion, contraception, reproductive autonomy, child care, equal pay, psychological integrity, constitutes a threat to our civilization, and this amounts to a blasphemy against God. Whores of Babylon, Darwin's theory of evolution, and the menace of world communism all somehow get subliminally mixed up in this feminist threat. For some very good historic and psychological reasons we will later explore. For now, it is enough to say that God and civilization are loaded concepts, loaded with dynamite, that can always be brought in to end an argument that cannot otherwise be refuted. Or, for those who don't lean too heavily on God or who major in civilization, you can always quote an anthropologist. For just as established religions assume the maleness of God, just as Freud and psychoanalysts assume the maleness of libido, so have the social sciences, and in particular anthropology, assumed the genetic maleness of human evolution. Both popular and academic anthropological writers have let's see, presented us with scenarios of human evolution that feature almost exclusively the adventures and inventions of man, the hunter, man, the toolmaker, man, the territorial marker, and so forth. Woman is not comprehended as an evolutionary or evolutionizing creature. She is treated rather as an auxiliary to a male dominated evolutionary process. She mothers him, she mates him, she cooks his dinner, she follows around after him, picking up loose rocks. He evolves, she follows. He evolutionizes, she adjusts. If the book jackets don't give us pictures of female Homo sapiens being dragged by their hair through 2 or 3 million years of He Man evolution, we are left to assume this was the situation. Okay. Um, let's see. This, despite the known fact that among contemporary and historic hunting gathering people, as among our remote hunting and gathering ancestors, 75% to 80% of the group's sustenance comes from the women's food gathering activities. This, despite the known fact that the oldest tools used by contemporary hunters and gatherers, and the oldest, most primal tools ever found in ancient sites, are women's digging sticks. This, despite worldwide legends that cite women as the first users and domesticators of fire. This, despite the known fact that women were the first potters, the first weavers, the first textile dyers and hide tanners, the first to gather and study medicinal plants, i.e., the first doctors, and on and on. Observing linguistic interplay between mothers and infants, mothers and children, and among work groups of women, it is easy to speculate on the female contribution to the origin and elaboration of language itself. That the first time measurements ever made, the first formal calendars, were women's lunar markings on painted pebbles and carved sticks, is also known. And it is thoroughly known that the only God image ever painted on rock, carved in stone, or sculpted in clay from the upper Paleolithic to the middle Neolithic, and that's roughly 30,000 years, was the image of a human female. In 1948, The Gate of Horn was published in Britain. In 1963, it was published in America, retitled Religious Conceptions of the Stone Age. In this pioneering work, archaeologist and scholar G. Rachel Levy showed the unbroken continuity of religious images and ideas descending from the Cro-Magnon peoples of the Upper Paleolithic period in Ice Age Europe through the Mesolithic and Neolithic developments in the Near East and down to our own historical time. As Levy noted, these early peoples are lost to us in the midst of time, but their primal visions, images, and gestalts of human existence on this planet still resonate in our psyches, as well as in our historic religious ontological symbols. These early Stone Age people bequeathed to all humanity a foundation of ideas upon which the mind could raise its structures. And what were these primal human images and ideas? The cave as the female womb, the mother as a pregnant earth, the magical fertile female as the mother of all mammals, the Venus of La Salle standing with the horn of the moon upraised in her hand, the cave as the female tomb where life is buried, painted blood red and awaiting rebirth. Levy shows the continuity of these images and symbols through the late Neolithic Near Eastern rites and mythologies, and their endurance 30,000 years later in modern religions. In Christianity, for example, with its central image of the birth of the sacred child in a cave like shelter surrounded by magic animals, and especially in Catholicism, the icon of the Great Mother who stands on the horned moon and awaits the rebirth of the world. The evidence leaves no doubt that these images were at the origins of what we call human psychological and spiritual expression. Levy's book is a masterpiece. It's received great praise upon both its British and American publications, and has since been virtually bypassed and ignored by the anthropological, archaeological, academic establishments. Why? Because her evidence is irrefutable. It shows with clarity and in the solidity of stone and bone that the first 30,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence was dominated by a celebration of the female processes, of the mysteries of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth, of the analogous abundance of the earth, of the seasonal movements of animal and the cycles of time in the great round of the mother. The Gate of Horn is as close as we can come to reading the sacred book of our early human ancestors. And it confirms what too many people do not want to know, that the first God was female. Since Levy wrote, the tendency has been to relegate these old Stone Age and Neolithic images to the psychological realm. They've become, quote, archetypes of the unconscious, and so forth, while anthropological writers proper, both academic and popular, continue to explain physical, real human development solely in terms of the experiences of the male body in hunting, aggression, and tool making. Thus, the female images, which are there and cannot be denied, are sideswiped, reduced to the subjective, mythic realms, and thus, for the first 30,000 years of human history, is denied us, relegated to a mind trip or psychological software. Even among feminists in recent years, there has arisen doubt that these images and symbols might be anything but mythology, i.e., unrealities. To approach our past, the female god, we need a wagon with at least two wheels. One is the mythical, historical, archaeological, and the other is the biological, anthropological. A strong track has already been laid down for the mystical, historical, archaeological wheel. Milestones along the track, milestones along that track, along with G. Rachel Levy's great work, are J.J. Bachofen, Myth, Religion, and Mother Right, Robert Briffault's The Mothers, Helen Diner's Mothers and Amazons, Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, Robert Graves' The White Goddess, O.G.S. Crawford's The Eye Goddess, Sybil von Klessreden's In the Realm of the Great Goddess, Michael Dame's Silbury Treasure and the Avebury Cycle, Marija Gembuta's The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, and most recently Elizabeth J. Davis's The First Sex, Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman and Ancient Mirrors of Womanhood, Phyllis Chesler's Women and Madness and About Men, Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born, Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, Gyne, Ecology, and Pure Lust, Susan Griffin's Woman and Nature, Anne Cameron's Daughters of Copper Woman, and many, many more, including the richly useful Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker. The other side of our wagon, the biological, anthropological side, has almost no wheel and no track. Not because there is no important place to go in that direction, but because the physical cultural anthropologists are off somewhere else, busily mapping the evolution of Tarzan. There is no body of anthropological work based on the evolution of female biology. With rare exceptions, there have been no attempts whatsoever to study the evolution of human physiology and cultural organization from humanid to modern man, from the perspective of the definitive changes undergone by the female in the process of that evolution. Popular books on the subject by Lionel Tiger, Desmond Morris, et al. Are invariably male oriented, treating the evolution of the female as sex objects only. From Monkey in Heat to Hot Bunny, one delightful exception is Elaine Morgan's The Descent of Woman. During 12 million years of um, dry Pliocene, Morgan speculates the female prehumanid took to the oceans, surviving the warm, food-filled coastal waters, and during this experience underwent a sea change from knuckle-walking rear sex primate to upright human sexual body, to which the male primate responded by becoming man. Morgan argues convincingly that the human species survived the long Pliocene drought through the cooperation and social invention of the evolving humanid females in their adaptation to the sea. Academic experts ignored this theory, but they have no other explanation for our Pliocene survival, for our successful evolution from ape to human during this difficult period, or for the many ways in which our human bodies resemble the bodies of sea mammals rather than primates. Excuse me. Let's see. In The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light, historian William Irwin Thompson points out that early human evolution occurred in three critical stages. One, harmonization, in which our primate bodies became human, not only in walking upright and freeing the hands, but specifically sexual characteristics and functions. Two, symbolization, in which we began using speech, marking time, painting and sculpting images. And three, the agriculturalization, in which we domesticated seed and began control of food production. And, as Thomas writes, all three stages were initiated and developed by the human female. This symbol making and agricultural stages have been studied, and the originating role of women in these stages is well known. It is sexual harmonization, which, as yet, has barely been explored. Why? Why indeed? Because sexual harmonization is almost exclusively the story of the human female. The mechanics and anatomy of male sexuality, after all, haven't changed greatly since the primates made love. The revolution in human sexuality, the revolution that made us human, resulted from evolutionary changes that occurred in the female body. These changes were not primarily related to mammalian reproduction, but to human sexual relationship. No one knows the order in which they occurred, but taken together as an evolved cluster of sexual characteristics, they constitute a truly radical sexual metamorphosis undergone by the human female. Elimination of the estrous cycle and the development of the menstrual cycle meant that women were not periodically in heat, but capable of sexual activity at any time. Pregnancy could occur during a part of a cycle, but for the most of the sexual sex could happen without necessarily resulting in pregnancy. Among all other animals, the estrous cycle determines that copulation always results in pregnancy and has no other than a reproductive purpose. Development of the clitoris and the evolution of the vagina meant a greatly enhanced sexuality and orgasmic potential in human females compared to all other animals. The change from rear to frontal sex, we can imagine, created an enormous change in relation between the sexes. Frontal sex means a prolonged and enhanced lovemaking period and what might be called the personalization of sex. the emotion evoking role of face to face intercourse in the development of human self consciousness has yet to be evaluated. She turned around and looked him in the eye, and there was light. And lastly, the development of breasts added to woman's potential for sexual arousal, further combined with frontal sex. No doubt the female's maternal and social feelings were also now aroused by the personal lover whose body was now analogous to the infant's body at her breast. As Thompson points out, such radical changes in the female body alone were enough to trigger the harmonization of the species. Human beings, with these changes, became the only creatures on Earth for whom copulation can occur anytime for non reproductive purposes. Human sex thus became a multi purpose activity. It can happen for emotional bonding, for social bonding, for pleasure, for communication, for shelter and comfort, for personal release, for escape, as well as for reproduction of the species. And this is one of the original and major determining differences between humans and all other animals, birds, reptiles, insects, fish, worms, for whom copulation exists only and solely for species reproduction. The human race has been definitively shaped by the revolution of the female body into the capacity for non reproductive sex. This is not just a physical fact, it is a cultural, religious, and political fact of primary significance. Many feminists today are unsure whether studies of evolutionary biology or of religious mythology can have political relevance for contemporary women. We believe that nothing could be more politically relevant than knowing why we got where we are now by seeing how we got here and where we began. In the beginning, the first environment for all new life was female, the physical, emotional, spiritual body of the mother, and the communal body of women, young girls, grown women, older women working together. When hunting and gathering people move, the infant is carried bound close to the mother's body. When they settle, the women form an inner circle campsite of women and children. The socialization process begins here. Human culture is marked by a strengthening and prolongation of the relation between mothers and offspring. For its first year, the human child is virtually an embryo outside the womb, extremely vulnerable and totally dependent. Female group behavior, the cooperative care sharing among mothers and children, um, older and younger women in the tasks of daily life, emerges from the fact of this prolonged dependence of the human child on the human female for its survival. Males help, but they also leave. The male body comes and goes, but the female presence is a constant. Females train, discipline, and protect the young. Beyond infant care, the maintenance and leadership of the entire kin group is the task of women. The female animal is always on alert, for on her rests the responsibility not only of feeding the young, but of keeping the young from being food for others. She is the giver and also the sustainer of beginning life. Among humans, males help with protection and food acquisition, but it is the communal group of females that surrounds the child in its first 4 to 6 years of life with a strong physical, emotional, traditional, and linguistic presence. And this is the foundation of social life and human culture. The popular image of early human society as being dominated, indeed created, by sexist male hunters and ferocious territorial headbangers just doesn't hold water. If the first humans had depended solely on despotic and aggressive male leaders or on several males in chronic ritualistic contention for power, human society would never have developed. Human culture could never have been invented. Human presence on earth would never have evolved. The fact is that it was from this first inner circle of women, the campsite, the fireside, the cave, the first hearth, the first cycle of birth, that human society evolved. As humanids evolved into the Paleolithic Homo sapiens and then into settled and complex Neolithic village people on the time edge of civilization, these tens of thousands of years of human culture were shaped and sustained by communities of creative, sexually and physically active women. Women who were inventors, producers, scientists, physicians, lawgivers, visionary shaman, and artists. Women who were also mothers, receivers, and transmitters of terrestrial and cosmic energy. We have to understand how and why these ancient millennia of women cultures have been buried, ignored, denied, passed off as mythology or primitive prehistoric origins by Western male historians who insist, often and often really believe, that real history began only about 5,000 years ago with the relatively recent institutions of patriarchy. That ends chapter 1. Chapter 2, Marx and the Matriarchy. Ancient woman-oriented groupings were the original communism. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx recognized this. Engels especially refers to the mother right concepts of J.J. Bachofen, and both men based their analysis of social development on the primary existence of ancient matriarchies, i.e., communal matrifocal systems. In this, they were influenced by the writings of Lewis Morgan, an American anthropologist. Morgan lived with and studied the tribal society of the Iroquois in their kinship structure, language, and customs. He found evidence of early communal and blood relations based on different stages of group marriage. In Ancient Society, written in Ancient Society, written in the 1880s, Morgan offered his conclusion that such a society was matrilineal and matrifocal of necessity, since within a group marriage structure, only the mother can definitely be known as the parent of the child. We now know that similar evidence can be found all over the world, for example. Many kinship systems distinguish between the biological father of a child and the social father, who is usually the mother's brother or other male relative. The social father is considered the real father in these societies. Identity and inheritance are passed through the female bloodlines. But pioneers that they were, neither Morgan, Engels, nor Marx were fully aware of women's real functions and achievements in past cultures, nor were they tuned into the total gestalt of early peoples. With Marx and Engels, and in particular with their dogmatic interpreters and followers, a narrowing of focus to strictly economic and class analysis has totally obscured the original human state of being, which was more profoundly spiritual than economic. This Marxist narrowing of focus and its consequent denial of human spiritual experience has had tragic repercussions throughout the world. How did this happen? Karl Marx, Engels as well, was a deeply compassionate man. His opium of the people statement, which is never fairly quoted, is evidence of his compassion. Quote, religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The demand to give up the illusions about conditions is the demand to give up the condition that needs illusions. Criticism has plucked the imagery, the imaginary flowers from the chain, not so that men will wear the chain without any fantasy or consolation, but so that they will break the chain and cull the living flower. End quote. No one has said it better or more clearly recognized the human being's absolute right to cling to spirit in a spiritless situation and to heart in a heartless world, because spirit and heart are real, and they alone have helped millions of human beings survive in otherwise unsurvivable situations. The tragedy, however, of Marx and of Marxists was to confuse spirit with established religions. They saw clearly and historically that established religions aligned itself with the oppressor, the oppressing class, the oppressing monarchy, the oppressing social and economic systems. They saw the seeds of oppression in religious doctrines, doctrines that rationalized poverty and enslavement and excused brutal tyranny and greed by setting God's seal on social systems based on hierarchies of rich and poor, hierarchies of rulers and the ruled. They saw the wealth and power of the churches and the wretched passivity of the believers. They saw that the church was, in fact, a very man made institution that gained and retained power by exploiting the reality of spirit versus the reality of physical need. They heard sermons condemning material wealth and earthly pleasures while the churchmen and their rich supporters lived in opulent security, and the mass of believers lived on their stony knees in rags. They heard these conditions justified as God's plan for man. They saw that religious establishments take upon themselves to define spirit and God and human destiny always in their elitist terms and only to their worldly advantage. Seeing these things, Marxists rightly condemned the collusion of established religions in the historic oppression of human beings. Tragically, however, they also denied the reality of human spirit and its genuine longings. They rightly wanted to save humanity from religious exploitation, but in their narrowing of focus, their economic and class reductiveness, they split the human being into two conflicting parts: material existence versus spiritual existence. This split was just the mirror image of the already existing religious dualism. As dogmatic Marxist communism unfolded in country after country, this split reinforced the same alienation of the human condition that Marx had wanted to resolve. It has created the dreary state capitalism of Soviet Russia and its satellites, in which state works dourly and mechanically to enforce its definition of human life as spiritless mechanism. It has given fuel to the propaganda engines of the reactionary systems in all countries, so that the world is ripped apart in a false dichotomy between godless communism and divine capitalism. For if communism is atheistic, its opponents can claim to be mandated by God, however phony this claim may be. Finally, it has turned away untold millions of oppressed human beings who need the economic and social analysis of Marxism to clarify and change their situations, but who fear they are being asked to buy this analysis at the price of their very living souls. No matter how corrupt and collusive the established religions of the world are known to be, they still stand there, offering themselves as the only sanctuaries of spirit in a spiritless world. Marxism stands, unfortunately, in the perception of too many people as a total fanatical repudiation of spiritual reality. And this perception of Marxism has helped to fuel the equally fanatic revivals of the fundamentalist religions throughout the world today. Marx and Engels confused spirit with established religion, as their doctrinaire followers continue to do so today, because as Western white males, they could not see the total paradigm of ancient women's original communism. Coming from this linear, fragmenting, and reductive Western transition, which has historic roots in the Judeo-Christian Bible, as well as the Aristotelian, Platonic, Greco-Roman hyper-rationality, they could not comprehend the primal holism of human experience on earth. As a result, Marxism tends to reinforce rather than oppose Western capitalism's notorious strategy of alienation. Marxist analysis generally are obsessed with isolating economic productive development from magical, religious, sexual development. As Paul Cardin, a libertarian thinker, writes, there is the Marxist, this is a quote, There is a Marxist assumption that throughout history, human societies have always aimed first and foremost to increase production and consumption. But the human being does not at birth bear within itself the finishing meaning of her or his life. The maximization of consumption or of power or of sanctity are not tendencies inherent to the newborn child. It is the prevailing culture in which he or she will be brought up, which will teach him or her that he or she needs these things. The cultivation of maize among the Mexican tribes, or the cultivation of rice in some Indonesian villages, is not only a means of ensuring food. Agricultural labor is also lived as goddess and child worship, as festival and as dance. And when some Marxist theoretician comes along and claims that on these occasions everything which is not directly productive labor is but mystification, illusion, or cunning of reason, it must be forcefully pointed out that he is himself a far more complete personification of patriarchy and capitalism than any mere boss could be. What he is saying is that everything that humans have done or sought to do in history was only crude prefigurations of the factory system. End quote. If the Marxist in this case was denouncing or trying to eliminate patriarchal religion, founded on privilege and property and the mystification of reality, and functioning through the exploitation of human labor and human sexuality, then that would be fine. But he is also denying what is the very truth of human experience, human existence, and the essence of the original matriarchies, the experienced unity of psychic, productive, sexual, cosmic power and activity in the egalitarian collective of women. For this is precisely what patriarchy sets out to do. Hear me, okay? This is precisely what patriarchy sets out to do, to split material production from spiritual experience, science from magic, medicine from herbal knowledge and psychic seasonal environment, sexuality from the sacred, art from craft, astronomy from astrology, language from poetry, and to place the resultant specialized, abstracted, and mechanistic knowledge in the hands of a privileged male elite organized into professions and hierarchies and classes to reduce the ecstatic dance of muscle, blood, and soul to factory assembly lines, production output schedules, and the gross national product. Patriarchy divides life into higher and lower categories, labeled spirit versus nature, or mind versus matter, and typically is the alienated symbolism. The superior spirit mind is male and or white, while the inferior nature matter is female and or black. This false dualistic symbolism arises from an enforced order of male domination. With the aid of such phallic psychology, men can then go about the earth raping nature, exploiting resources and human labor, manipulating and improving her with technological, mechanical inventions and progressive goals. In patriarchy, man separates from earth, emulating some aloof and disconnected sky god of his own creation. And this intellectual separation makes him feel free to devastate the natural world without any sense that it belongs to a common ecosystem with himself. He exploits it totally alienated from the fact of his own continuity with it for the deluded profit of the few and the existential pain of the many. Patriarchy exists by destroying the original holism. When it refutes or opposes the reality of human spiritual experience, Marxist communism does not resolve this destruction. It only compounds it with a different rhetoric. It gets rid of God and church only to substitute another tyranny, that of state and the machine, or the party or the production quota. It does not truly free human beings. It only changes the brand name of the chains. A truly human politics must study the entire history of the world's religions and spiritual beliefs. It must try to return to or move toward spiritual systems that are harmonious with all of our visions of creative communal life. Because this is what is missing under both the competing world powers, a creative communal life. Both systems, Western capitalism and socialist and Soviet communism, are based on the denial of communal celebration. For celebration is a play of the spirit, and there is no profit in celebration. And there is no profit in celebration. There is no profit in communal experience. But human evolution, human creativity is a real miracle, a cosmic fact. We need a politics that participates in this biological spiritual adventure. Neither the God of the dollar nor the God of the state, nor any of the alienating patriarchal gods from which they descend allow for this participation. William Reich is not commonly connected with Marxism, but this is where he began. His early work was an attempt to link the Marxist economic class analysis with a psychoanalytical understanding of the significance of sexual repression in the development of fascist patriarchal society. This attempt was mostly successful, and for it, he was excommunicated by both the European Communist Party and the Freudian psychoanalytical circles, i.e., he was onto something. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism and other works in the 1930s, Reich chronicled the successful manipulation of the German people by Nazi ideology. On the deepest psychological and biological levels, he argued, the people had already been conditioned by generations of religious and culturally directed psychosexual repression to respond obediently, to cooperate questioningly with sadism, tyranny, and genocide. An anti-sexual religious morality, paranoid concepts of blood purity, and a rigid sense of ethnic superiority had already wired the nervous system of the torturer and clenched the muscles inside black gloves and boots. As Reich showed, predicted in fact, a hypnotic leader like Hitler does not create these conditions, he only exploits them. Fascism is not a wild, barbaric phenomena that appears suddenly and without reason in the midst of civilization. Huh. It is the It is the result of a long conditioning process, and the institutions that do the conditioning are those of the civilization. The institutions that do the conditioning are those of the civilization itself. One of Reich's major points was that Marxist communism and European socialism generally narrowed down to an objective focus on economic and class relationships, were unable to anticipate, analyze, or prevent the Nazi triumph, which was a massively subjective explosion of a pathologically conditioned people into brutal expression. Further, the syndrome of fascism was not confined to the Germans. Fascists Fascist thought and behavior is not a national aberration, but a historically ingrained feature of the psyche of all Western civilized people, a feature clearly visible in the history of Western colonialism and imperialism. Reich's political point was this: at this point in history, changing the objective economic social systems alone is not enough. Repressive behavior, oh my God, sadistic power relations let's see, sadistic power relations, competitive greed to exploit, dominate, and humiliate. And our accommodations to these insults are by now conditioned into the nervous systems of each member of our civilized societies. Both oppressors and victims are damaged by the experience. The repressive wiring of the nervous system occurs at the most intimate levels of sex and spirit. The recreation of the human being must occur on these levels also if we desire a truly human revolution, one that does more than just change the guard. This point, this is this point is of importance to feminists who have already observed that sexist, dominating male behavior can occur along entire political spectrum from right to left. The repression, control, and exploitation of female sexuality is a major tool of patriarchy because it goes hand in hand with the exploitation of female labor. Left wing males who see no connection between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation have failed to make a total analysis, or in Reich's terms, they have failed to undergo a total revolution. On the neuron level, they are still wired for oppression. Reich pointed out that in the 1930s, that the prevalent male sexual fantasy in male-dominated society is one of rape. And he knew that this was not a personal fantasy, but a political one with political repercussions. He was very clear on how sexual repression of women has been the most powerful patriarchal weapon in creating social victims. Females who have been weakened, made dependent, fearful, or ashamed of our own bodies, and punished for their functions, sexual psychological prey. Um, Sexual psychological prey to any predator. Such creatures are easy to exploit politically and economically. People who do not own their sex cannot own their own labor. Unfortunately, Reich was a strict heterosexual, unsympathetic to homosexuality, and too influenced by Freudian ideas of female sexuality. And these problems have been passed along to us at the expense of his gifts. Reich missed the connections between bisexuality and psychic wholeness, but in his comprehension of the profound and intentional links between sexual repression and political repression, he was always right on target. Marx said, human power is its own end. Reich was devoted to the liberation and enjoyment of healthy human power as the only valid political goal. Biological energy, unrepressed and undistorted, he saw as a continuum of cosmic energy with no non organic distinctions made between the physical and the spiritual. He saw both as forms of energy that he called orgon, manifest throughout the universe, the same in nerve cells as in stars and in human consciousness. This evolutionary energy surging through all life forms and as energy field in space, he defined as a spiritual reality as well as a physical force. And he believed that politics included the realignment of the repressed human being with the original creative flow, i.e., Reich was no mechanistic ideologue, but a political mystic. Therefore, he was banished from the Communist Party and psychoanalytical professional circles in Europe. He had to flee Nazi Germany, and he ended up in the United States with his books destroyed by the federal government and his works outlawed. He died in a federal prison, i.e., he was probably onto something. Another problem area among Marxists is the assumption that matriarchal society, where it existed, occurred only at very low stages of production and under only primitive conditions. This assumption echoes the generalized linearity and chauvinism of Western history, which tends to see all other cultures, other in space and time, as mere preliminary stages on the way toward modern develop, or as sadly failed attempts to achieve the freeway and the ball bearing. In fact, the evidence shows that some of the most advanced societies of the ancient world, technologically as well as culturally advanced, were also matrifocal, i.e., women oriented and led by women. The early Cretians were worshippers of the goddess, and Cretan women were priestesses, judges, doctors, artisans, athletes, business entrepreneurs, cultural leaders on all levels. Crete was the major cultural and trading center of its day, with ships traveling to Ireland, Spain, Africa, and the Near East for gold and tin. One of the things exported was the Cretan lineal script, whose syllabary was passed on through the Greeks and to the Phoenicians. At home, the Cretans had indoor baths with hot and cold water running through ceramic pipes. Cretan plumbing in 1700 BC was far superior to anything achieved in Europe until well after AD 1700. The graceful and artistic Etruscans were also matriarchal, and so were the early Egyptians. Traces of matriarchy existed in Egypt down through the later empires and dynasties. In these cultures, as in many others, the family groups lived on land that belonged collectively to the mothers. A woman's husband or lover lived with the woman and her kin group. Children, regardless of the father's identity or legal relation, lived with the mother's family group. Ancient Egyptian law clearly designated that all family property, land, and household goods belonged to the woman, and that she, married or unmarried, had total disposition of her own belongings, including herself. No one studied the Cretans, Etruscans, or Egyptians could refer to these cultures as primitive. Very advanced cultures were also developed by the matriarchal Dahomey and Ashanti peoples of West Africa, and by the Naya people of Kerala in southern India. Among Native Americans, it is largely matrifocality of the Pueblo people that has allowed them to endure so long in their old ways, with strong architectural technologies developed among them. The dwelling places of all these people, from portable grass huts to multi storied apartment buildings, were not simply maintained by women, but built by women. Everywhere, homesite technology was originally seen as woman's province. We are not saying that matriarchy was a system in which the women went around ruling everyone with a big stick. Matriarchies are not built on dominance principles, but on the facts of blood kinship, including the primacy of the mother. Women owned their bodies, their children, and their living properties. Women made vital decisions affecting the survival and well being of the group. There was no way by which an elite group of men could set up laws to restrict women's movements, ideas, or sexual activity. Economic relations were not experienced as separate from religious or social relationships. They were originally based on gift exchange, which served as a communal bonding function, not a competitive profit making one. Material goods had value only in terms of the social or spiritual uses to which they were put. If Marxists tend to underrate ancient matrifocal cultures as primitive or underdeveloped, this is only because Marxists share Western prejudices about development. They are assuming that all cultures, ancient and modern, are to be judged according to how close they come to approximating the industrial factory system with its quantitative production, regardless of the life quality of the cultures being evaluated. And this prejudice, Marxists and stock market men seem to share equally. So I will stop there. I will pick up tomorrow with the continuation into chapter 3, which is entitled The Original Black Mother. My name is Cassandra-Floyd, also known as Iyapo Ngina, also known as the Rogue Black Girl. You can check in the description below for information on how to tune into the book club and analysis classes that we'll be doing on this book throughout the period that I'll be reading this book. Those classes end on July 17th and the first and third Sunday of every month until July 17th. So we have a little journey that we're about to go on. The book will change your life. So be open to receiving it, and I will see you again tomorrow. More than likely at around 9 a.m. to continue the reading of The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Zhu. That glare on there, sorry about that. By Monica Zhu and Barbara Moore. So my email address and contact information are in the links, are in the description below, and I will see you tomorrow.